There's a folder on the table in front of me, and my hand is resting flat on top of it, the way you rest your hand on something you're not ready to open yet. The restaurant is the kind of quiet that costs money. Low light, thick napkins, a private table tucked away from the main dining room, so conversations like this one don't carry. Across from me, Grace Lou sets down her wine glass, unhurried, and says the sentence so casually I almost miss the weight underneath it. We'll need the finalized operations documentation, with proper attribution for our records. Derek laughs before I can respond, the easy laugh he uses when he wants a room to relax around him. She's basically my right hand on all this, he says, nodding toward me without quite looking at me, already reaching for his phone like the matter is settled. I can pull together whatever you need by Monday. Grace doesn't laugh back. She looks at him, then at me, and waits, the particular patience of someone used to getting real answers instead of comfortable ones. I want you to understand something before I tell you how we got to this table, because I think it matters for everything that comes after. I am not a woman who makes scenes. In 22 years of marriage, I have never once raised my voice over a dinner table. My entire adult life has been built around being the person who smooths things over, who fixes what's broken before anyone else even notices it was broken in the first place. So when I tell you that in this exact moment, with my hand flat against that folder, something in me had gone completely still, I need you to understand that stillness isn't the same thing as calm. Stillness is what's left over after calm finally runs out. Inside that folder are 6 months of quiet, careful work. Dated documents. A login history with timestamps that don't lie. The original version of a client retention strategy one wrote 3 years ago, printed side by side with the version my husband put his own name on and presented to the 2 people across this table. Derek doesn't know the folder exists. As far as he's concerned, tonight is a formality. One last polished dinner before the paperwork closes on a deal that's going to turn Voss Construction into a real regional player. He still thinks I'm the woman who quietly makes everything easier for him, the one who fixes things before he has to notice they were ever broken. He has no idea I stopped being that woman months ago. He just hadn't been paying close enough attention to notice. This story didn't actually begin at this table, though. It began 22 years earlier, in a version of my life where I still believed that if I worked hard enough and asked for almost nothing in return, someone would eventually notice on their own, without my ever having to say a word about it. I was wrong about that for a very long time. This is the story of how I finally stopped being wrong about it. My name is Maya Voss. I'm 47 years old, and for most of my marriage, I've run a business I've never technically worked for. Derek owns Voss Construction, 34 employees now, spread across commercial and residential contracts in 3 counties, a company that's grown steadily for over a decade. What most people who know us don't realize, because Derek has never once told them, is that I'm the person who actually built the systems that keep it running. The scheduling software that coordinates 6 crews across active job sites without a single double booking. The vendor relationships I've spent 10 years cultivating one phone call at a time. The kind where a supplier will rush an order for us because they trust me personally, not because a contract requires it. The payroll process, which I redesigned after catching an error that would have cost the company $11,000 in a single quarter. The client follow-up system that turned one-time customers into repeat business, year after year, quietly, without anyone above me ever asking how it happened. I've never been on payroll. I've never held a title. When people ask what I do, Derek usually answers before I get the chance. And the answer is almost always some version of, she helps out around the office. It started 12 years ago, during a slow winter when Derek's office manager quit without notice, and he couldn't afford to replace her right away. I told him I'd cover things for a few weeks while he figured it out. The few weeks became a year, and the year became the entire operational architecture of a growing company, built quietly at my kitchen table while Derek was out on job sites shaking hands and signing contracts. I don't think I ever consciously decided to disappear into the business. I think I just kept being useful one small task at a time, until being useful became the only shape I knew how to take inside my own marriage. Our daughter Ellie is 20 now, home from college for our anniversary weekend, and she's sharper about certain things than I ever let myself be at her age. Last week, watching me take a vendor call at 10 at night while Derek watched a game in the next room without moving, she asked me, half joking and half not, "Does Dad actually know how much you do around here?" I told her of course he knows. I said it so easily, so automatically, that I almost believed it myself for a second. I have history with this particular kind of blindness. When I was 14, I started running the books for my father's small hardware store after school, 3 afternoons a week, for 3 straight years. I caught pricing errors that would have cost him real money. I reconciled accounts he'd let slide for months. He still introduced me to customers, every single time, as just helping out around the store. Never as capable, never with my name attached to anything I'd actually fixed. I learned early, at an age when you're not supposed to be learning things like this, that competence performed quietly gets absorbed into the furniture of a place. It stops being noticed as a choice you're making and starts being treated as something that was simply always going to be there. I didn't understand at 14 that I was learning a lesson I'd spend the next 3 decades relearning. In a different kitchen, with a different man, and almost exactly the same silence waiting on the other side of it. There's a version of my adult life that looks, from the outside, entirely enviable. A stable marriage. A daughter in college who calls home more than most of her friends do. A house that's paid down, a husband whose company keeps growing, a kitchen with good light in the mornings. I've never once wanted for anything material, and I think that's part of why it took me so long to notice what I actually did want, and had never once let myself say out loud. I remember the exact year it tipped from helping out into running the place, though I don't think anyone else in the family would be able to point to it the way I can. It was the winter Derek lost 2 crews to a competitor who paid better. The same winter our roof needed replacing, and Ellie was starting middle school and needed 100 small things all at once. I built the first version of the scheduling spreadsheet on a Tuesday night after everyone was asleep, mostly because I couldn't sleep myself and needed something to do with my hands. By that spring, it wasn't a spreadsheet anymore. It was the system 3 different crew leads called me directly to ask about when something didn't line up. Derek never asked how I'd learned to do any of it. I don't think it occurred to him to ask, the same way it never occurred to my father to ask how a 14-year-old had caught an error in his books that he'd missed for months. Competence, when it belongs to a wife or a daughter, tends to get treated like weather. Something that's simply there, doing what it does, without anyone stopping to wonder where it came from or what it cost to maintain. Our 20th anniversary fell on a Saturday in September, and Derek had been planning the dinner for weeks, which should have been entirely sweet, and mostly was, except for the one part one didn't fully understand until it was already too late to change anything about it. "Grace and Marcus are coming," he told me a week before, casual, the way you'd mention the caterer or the flowers. Grace Liu and her business partner Marcus were 2 names I'd been hearing for months. Potential investors, the kind of deal that could take Voss Construction from a solid regional company to something genuinely significant. The kind of deal Derek had been chasing carefully for the better part of a year. I knew it was close. I hadn't realized, until that moment, that our anniversary dinner had quietly become part of the pitch itself. "You're inviting investors to our anniversary dinner?" "They're not investors yet," Derek said, which wasn't really an answer to what I'd asked. "It's just easier this way. They get to see us as real people, not just numbers on a page. It helps close things. Trust me." I let it go the way I let most things go, because arguing about the guest list of my own anniversary dinner felt smaller than it actually was, and I've spent 22 years choosing my battles so carefully that most of them never got fought at all. I've come to understand only recently that a person can spend their whole life choosing battles so carefully they forget they were ever allowed to have any. Ellie noticed things that morning I'd stopped letting myself notice a long time ago. We were in the kitchen together, her cutting vegetables while I went over the caterer's final head count, and she said, without looking up from the cutting board, "Dad's been practicing what he's going to say to them." Like, actually practicing. I heard him in the bathroom mirror this morning. That's just Dad, I said, and meant it mostly as something gentle. Something forgiving. I used to think that was just how you guys were, Ellie said, quiet, still not looking up. Lately it feels different. I can't explain it better than that. I didn't ask her what she meant. I think some part of me already knew, and wasn't ready to hear it said plainly out loud. Not on the one day I was supposed to be celebrating 20 years of having chosen this particular life on purpose. On the mantel in our living room, there's a framed photograph from our wedding day. Me at 25 laughing, standing beside a chalkboard sign my college roommates made as a joke gift for the reception, reading future CFO in big, uneven letters. I walked past that photograph 3 separate times that morning, carrying serving trays back and forth, and didn't look at it once. It had been part of the furniture for so long that I'd genuinely forgotten it used to mean something specific to me. The private dining room at the restaurant was warm and low-lit, the kind of place that makes everyone's voice sound a little softer than it usually does. Derek gave a toast about 20 years and everything we'd built together, and it was a good toast, genuinely. He's always been good in front of a room. Ray, Derek's father, raised his glass and said something brief and formal about how proud he was, the way he always does, careful not to say too much all at once. It was going well. I remember thinking that specific sentence to myself, "It's going well," right before it stopped being true. Grace turned to me sometime between the appetizers and the entrees, genuinely curious in the way people are when they actually want to hear the answer. "So what do you do, Maya?" I opened my mouth. I had an answer ready, a real one, 12 years in the making, something I'd never quite gotten the chance to say out loud in a room like this one. Derek got there first. "She doesn't really do anything for the business," he said, laughing, easy and warm, the exact laugh that makes rooms relax around him. "She just makes sure I show up on time and don't burn the place down." The table laughed. Marcus laughed. Ray gave a small, tired chuckle that didn't quite make it to his eyes. Grace laughed too, polite, brief, and I watched it happen in real time, watched her laugh not reach her eyes either, watched something flicker and settle behind them instead. I smiled. I want to be honest about that part, because I think it matters more than the rest of it. I smiled the way I've smiled through 1,000 small dismissals across 22 years of marriage, and I said something forgettable about the wine list. And a minute later I excused myself to the restroom, unhurried, calm, walking exactly the way you walk when you're trying very hard not to look like you're walking away from something. I didn't cry in that bathroom. I want that to be clear because what I felt standing at that sink was quieter than crying and much more dangerous to the way I'd been living my life up until that point. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment and thought, he wasn't even being cruel. That was the part that undid me, more than the joke itself. He hadn't been trying to hurt me. He'd said it the way you'd state a fact everyone at the table already agreed on. When I came back out, Ray was leaning toward Ellie, saying something I only half caught over the noise of the room. "Your mother used to do the books for me too, you know," he said to her, quiet, almost to himself, like a confession he wasn't quite ready to make out loud to the whole table. "Long time ago." Ellie went very still after that. She didn't say much for the rest of the dinner. I finished the evening smiling, thanking people for coming, answering questions about the venue. And somewhere underneath all of that pleasant surface, something had already begun to shift. Though if you'd asked me that night, I couldn't have told you exactly what. In the car on the way home, Derek reached over and squeezed my hand at a red light, the way he's done 1,000 times over 22 years, a small, automatic gesture that used to mean something uncomplicated to me. "Good night, right?" he said, glancing over, genuinely pleased with how it had gone. Grace seemed really warm toward the end there. "It was a good night," I said, and I wasn't entirely lying. Most of it had been good. I looked out the window at the streetlights sliding past and thought about how strange it was that a single sentence could sit inside an otherwise good evening like a stone in a shoe, small enough that you could keep walking on it, painful enough that you never quite forgot it was there. Ellie texted me around midnight, after I'd already gone quiet in bed beside Derek's steady breathing. "Just you okay?" 3 words, nothing more. I looked at my phone in the dark for a long moment before I typed back, "I'm fine, sweetheart. Go to sleep." It wasn't a lie exactly. It also wasn't the truth. I think that was the first night in a long time I understood there was a real difference between the two, and that I'd been living comfortably in the gap between them for years. 2 days later, Derek forwarded me a vendor contract. The subject line read, "When you get a chance." No mention of the dinner anywhere in the email. No acknowledgement, however small, that anything had happened at all. I sat with my laptop open for a long time before I did anything with it. It was the same kind of negotiation I'd handled dozens of times. A supplier trying to quietly renegotiate terms mid-contract. Exactly the kind of complicated, high-stakes back-and-forth Derek had just told a room full of important people I wasn't capable of. I called Carla that afternoon, mostly because I needed to say the thing out loud to somebody who wasn't going to tell me I was overreacting to a joke. He didn't even bring it up, I told her, the phone tucked against my shoulder while I scrolled through the contract terms without really reading them. Not an apology. Not even one word acknowledging it happened. "Would you have wanted him to?" Carla asked, and it wasn't really a question so much as a door she was holding open for me. "I don't know what I wanted," I admitted, and that part was true. I think I wanted him to understand it mattered without me having to explain to him why it mattered. "Maya." Carla has a specific way of saying my name that means she's about to say the thing I don't want to hear. "He forwarded you a contract 2 days later like nothing happened because to him, genuinely, nothing did happen. That's not him forgetting to apologize. That's him not understanding at any level that there's anything here to apologize for." I didn't answer right away. I looked at the contract on my screen, terms I could read the way other people read a grocery list, second nature, automatic. And I thought about how long I'd been telling myself Derek's dismissiveness was just a rough edge, a habit that would eventually wear down if I stayed patient enough, loved him well enough, gave him enough time. How long had he actually believed this about me? Not since the dinner. I understood that clearly now, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a contract I was about to fix for free, again, the same way I always had. This wasn't new behavior. This was simply the first time it had happened somewhere I couldn't quietly absorb it and keep moving. The follow-up dinner with Grace and Marcus happened 2 weeks later at Derek's office instead, more formal this time. The kind of meeting where deal terms actually get discussed in detail instead of just gestured toward over wine. Derek had put together a slide deck. I hadn't seen it beforehand. Nobody had thought to show it to me. I sat near the back of the small conference room, technically there to help with logistics and coffee, and watched him click through slide after slide of what he called operational strengths. The scheduling system that coordinated 6 crews without a single double booking, the vendor relationship network that had cut supply delays nearly in half, the payroll efficiency that had trimmed administrative overhead by almost a third. Every one of those systems was mine. I'd built the scheduling software from a spreadsheet I first sketched out 4 years earlier. I'd spent a full decade cultivating those vendor relationships, one careful phone call at a time. I'd redesigned payroll myself after catching an error that would have cost the company $11,000. Derek called all of it my systems. Twice in the space of that single presentation. He never once looked toward the back of the room while he said it. I sat through that hour with my hands folded quietly in my lap, watching my own work narrated back to a room as somebody else's expertise, and I want to tell you I felt rage, because that would make for a simpler story. What I actually felt was something quieter and colder than rage, a kind of clarity settling slowly into place. The way a photograph comes into focus once you finally stop trying to see it the way you'd prefer it to look. That night, after everyone had gone home, I started keeping a list. Not of grievances. I want to be specific about that distinction because it would have been so easy to start a running list of every slight, every dismissive comment, every small cruelty dressed up carefully as a joke. That isn't what I wrote down. I wrote dates. The dinner. The contract email. This meeting, and the exact phrase he'd used. I documented it the same clean, methodical way I'd document a discrepancy for any client whose books didn't reconcile properly. I didn't know yet what I was building toward. I only knew I wanted a record in case I ever needed one, and some quiet, patient part of me was already fairly certain that I would. I drove home from that meeting with the radio off, going over the presentation again and again in my head, trying to remember if there had been a single moment, any moment at all, where Derek could have said my name and chose deliberately not to. There had been at least 3 that I could recall clearly. Once, when Marcus asked how the vendor relationships had been built, and Derek said, "Years of relationship building on my end," without a flicker of hesitation. Once, when Grace asked about the payroll efficiency, and he'd said, "We tightened that up ourselves, though we doing a lot of quiet, dishonest work in that sentence." And once, near the very end, when he'd called the whole operational framework something I put together early on, as though I hadn't been the one sitting beside him at our kitchen table 4 years earlier, sketching the very first version of it onto the back of a grocery receipt because it was the only paper within reach. I thought about telling him that night, laying it all out calmly the way I eventually would months later. I didn't. I told myself I wanted to give him room to bring it up himself, unprompted, the way you'd give someone room to apologize before you have to ask for the apology directly. Looking back, I think what I actually wanted was more time to be certain, because some part of me still wasn't ready to accept what the pattern was already telling me plainly. Grace, genuinely impressed by Derek's systems, asked to schedule a technical walkthrough of the scheduling software with whoever managed it day to day, a perfectly reasonable due diligence request. Derek, caught flat-footed in the meeting, said he'd handle it himself. I want to be honest about what happened over the following week, because it's the part of this whole story I'm least proud of and most grateful for at exactly the same time. I watched my husband try to run something I had built and personally maintained for over a decade, and for the first time in 22 years of marriage, I let him struggle with it without stepping in. Monday, a crew showed up to the wrong job site entirely, because Derek had transposed 2 street addresses in the scheduling software. A mistake the system would have flagged automatically if he'd known where the override settings even lived. Wednesday, a vendor called me directly, confused, because Derek had sent through a purchase order with the wrong quantities listed twice over. A mistake I would have caught in about 10 seconds on any ordinary Tuesday. By Friday, he'd missed a payroll deadline entirely, which meant 3 subcontractors got paid 2 full days late. The kind of small failure that quietly erodes trust in an industry that runs almost entirely on trust between people. I knew about every single one of these mistakes well before he told me about any of them, because I still administered the login credentials for half of these systems. I could watch him logging in at strange hours, late at night, making changes, undoing them, trying again. I didn't fix a single one of them. Carla and I had coffee that Thursday afternoon, and she said the thing I think I needed someone else to say out loud before I could fully believe it myself. You're allowed to just watch this happen, you know. You don't automatically owe him a rescue every single time. It feels cruel, I admitted, turning my cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. Does it actually feel cruel? She asked. Or does it just feel unfamiliar to you? And I honestly didn't have a good answer to that either. Not that afternoon. Friday night, Derek came home looking noticeably older than he had that morning. The kind of tired that settles into someone's shoulders, not just their face. He didn't say much over dinner. Later, standing at the sink doing dishes, not quite looking at me, he said quietly, "Okay, you clearly know this stuff better than me." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I'd gotten from him in months, and some small, exhausted part of me wanted so badly to believe it actually meant something lasting. I want to describe one specific moment from that week because I think it says more than the rest of it combined. Wednesday afternoon, I was in the kitchen making Ellie's favorite soup for no particular reason, just because I wanted to, and Derek came in looking for the login credentials to check something on a job site he'd already checked twice. He stood in the doorway for a second, watching me stir the pot, and said, almost quietly, almost like he didn't mean for it to come out loud, "I don't know how you kept all of this straight for so long." I didn't answer right away. I gave him the password he needed, and he left, and I stood there at the stove a while longer, turning that sentence over. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to 1. But it was the first time in a long time he'd said something true about what I'd actually been doing, instead of a version of it small enough to fit comfortably beside his own story. I let myself hold on to that small true thing, even though I already suspected, somewhere underneath the hope, that it wasn't going to be enough on its own. That same week, I was helping my brother Tom set up clean contracts for a small independent business I'd been quietly building for 6 months by then. An operations consulting practice, properly registered, entirely legitimate, and completely separate from Voss Construction. Tom is a small business accountant, careful and steady by nature, the kind of person who asks the right question at exactly the right moment without ever making a big production out of asking it. We were sitting at his kitchen table one evening, going through old company records together to make sure my new client contracts wouldn't accidentally overlap with anything I'd already built for Derek's business, when I came across a folder I'd never seen before. Derek's actual marketing materials, the ones prepared specifically for Grace and Marcus. I opened it out of pure professional habit, the same reflexive way I check almost any document that crosses my desk. My name wasn't on a single slide. One slide near the end of the deck described the company's client retention strategy in detail. A strategy one had personally designed 3 years earlier, written out fully in a planning document I still had saved dated on my own laptop at home. In the investor materials, it was credited to leadership. Just that word. Generic, vague, and deliberately unattached to any actual specific person. I sat very still for a long moment, the folder open across my lap, Tom watching me carefully from across the table. "Does Derek know you've registered this yet?" Tom asked, nodding toward the LLC paperwork spread out beside the folder. And I understood immediately he wasn't really asking about the paperwork at all. He was asking whether I understood what I was actually quietly building toward. "No," I said. "Not yet." I didn't confront Derek that night. I drove home slowly and sat in our driveway for a long while before going inside, and what I felt wasn't fresh outrage. It was something closer to the floor finally settling under something that had been tilting, unnoticed, for a very long time. This wasn't a careless joke tossed off at a dinner table anymore. This was a formal document prepared well in advance, presented deliberately to 2 people whose decision genuinely mattered to our family's financial future, and it had erased me entirely by design, not by any kind of accident. I understood, sitting alone in that driveway with the engine off, exactly what I was actually dealing with for the first time. I went back inside eventually, because it was cold, and because Ellie was on the couch waiting up for me to watch the end of a movie she'd already seen twice. And there's something to be said for the way ordinary life keeps insisting on itself, even in the middle of a private reckoning. I sat down next to her, and she leaned into my shoulder the way she used to as a little girl, and for 40 minutes I let myself just be her mother, watching a movie neither of us was really paying attention to, instead of a woman quietly recalculating the entire shape of her marriage. Later that night, unable to sleep, I opened my own laptop and found the original strategy document, dated, time-stamped, saved in a folder I'd created years earlier and never once thought to protect, because it had never once occurred to me that I might need to prove something I already knew to be true. I read it over twice, my own handwriting from 3 years ago, somehow more convincing to me than my own memory. I didn't send it anywhere. I didn't do anything with it at all that night. I just closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a while, thinking about how strange it was to need proof of something I'd lived through myself, and how much stranger it was that I finally had it. Derek asked me a few days later to formally take over the technical walkthrough with Grace. "You clearly know this stuff better than me," he said again, as if it were a genuine gift he was giving me. I let myself believe, for roughly 48 quiet hours, that this was finally the real turning point. Real acknowledgement, at last, without me having to demand it out loud. The walkthrough itself went well. I answered every one of Grace's questions clearly and thoroughly, walked her carefully through the entire scheduling architecture, explained the vendor management system in language that made her nod slowly. The particular, deliberate nod of someone quietly recalibrating their understanding of an entire business in real time, right in front of you. Then Derek, standing right beside me, said to Grace, warm and easy as always, "Maya's basically my right hand on all of this. Not an operations manager. Not a systems architect. Not the person who had built and personally run an entire company's back office, unpaid, for 12 straight years. His right hand, an extension of him, not a person standing entirely in her own right." I felt the hope I'd been quietly carrying for 2 days deflate slowly, the particular way a tire loses air gradually enough that you don't even notice until you're already stuck somewhere on the shoulder of a road. Afterward, out in the parking lot, Grace caught up with me before I reached my car, her heels clicking against the pavement in the late afternoon light. "You built all of that," she said. It wasn't phrased as a question. "I did," I said. "Have you ever considered consulting independently? Operational systems specifically. I would genuinely hire you tomorrow, entirely separate from whatever ends up happening with Derek's deal." I told her I'd think about it. I already knew, standing there in that parking lot, that I would say yes. I simply didn't know yet how much saying yes was eventually going to cost me at home. I called Tom from the car before I even pulled out of the lot, still sitting in the driver's seat with the engine off. "I think I might actually be doing this," I told him. "You've been doing it for 6 months," he said. "You're just finally telling people about it." He wasn't wrong. I'd registered the LLC in the spring, quietly, on a lunch break between vendor calls, and hadn't told a single soul outside of Tom and Carla. I'd told myself at the time it was just prudent. No sense announcing something before it was real. Sitting in that parking lot months later, I understood it had also been something closer to fear. If nobody knew, nobody could ask me why I hadn't finished it yet, and I could keep it small and private and safe for as long as I needed to. Grace's offer changed that math overnight. It wasn't a hypothetical anymore. It was a real client with a real contract, willing to pay me for exactly the expertise my own husband had just spent an hour describing as his own. I sat in that car for a long time before I finally drove home, turning that particular kind of irony over slowly, the way you turn over a stone to see what's actually living underneath it. Over the following weeks, Derek noticed that something between us had quietly shifted. I stopped jumping in to fix his mistakes before he even noticed them himself. I started taking calls from a client he didn't recognize, spending my evenings on my own laptop instead of managing his spreadsheets for him. He asked about the calls first, casual, testing the water, then gradually less casual. "Who exactly is Grace's firm to you these days?" "A client," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm doing some independent consulting work." "That's a nice hobby," he said, and I watched him decide right in front of me that this was something harmless he could safely file away and stop thinking about, as long as it doesn't distract you from the real business. I raised the investor deck directly with him that same week. Calmly, the same way I'd raise any discrepancy in a client's books. I told him plainly that my name wasn't anywhere in the materials he'd prepared, that the client retention strategy described on slide 6 was, word for word, something I had written 3 years earlier. "Fine," he said, already reaching for his phone. "I'll add your name to a slide." That was the entire response. "Fine, I'll add your name to a slide," as though correcting 3 years of quiet erasure was equivalent to changing a font. Carla helped me name exactly what that was, over coffee a few days later, turning her cup slowly in her hands. "That's not him fixing anything," she said. "That's him managing you. There's a real difference between those two things, and I think you already know it." I stopped raising it directly with him after that conversation. Not because I'd given up, I want to be clear about that distinction, but because I finally understood that every single conversation about it, held in a room Derek fully controlled, was always going to end exactly the same way. I decided quietly to stop asking him to see it, and instead to let the people who were already paying attention see it clearly for themselves. Ellie called that same week, back on campus, and mentioned almost in passing, "I used to think that was just how you guys were, you know. I don't really think that anymore." I didn't ask her to say anything more than that. I think we both understood exactly what she meant without needing to spell it out further. I spent the weeks that followed doing what I have always done best in my life, organizing information carefully until it finally told the truth clearly, on its own, without any help from me. I finalized the LLC paperwork with Tom's help. I requested a clean copy of the investor slide deck from Derek's assistant, framing it as simple curiosity about how the company was currently being presented to outside partners, and cross-referenced the dated timestamps on my own original strategy documents against the deck's vague leadership language, line by line. I pulled the scheduling software's login history, which I still fully administered, and printed out the exact dates and error entries from Derek's difficult week, trying to run it entirely alone. None of it was obtained through snooping, and I want that to be understood clearly. Every single document I gathered was something I already had complete, legitimate access to. The same kind of records I would have pulled, without a second thought, for any client whose books didn't reconcile the way they should. David found me one evening at our kitchen table, folders spread out in the same organized fan I use for any careful audit, and he asked me the only question that actually mattered in that moment. "Are you doing this because you want to win?" he asked gently, "or because you want it to finally be over?" I didn't have an answer yet that felt entirely honest. I only knew with real certainty that I wanted to stop being the only person left who fully understood what had actually happened over the past several months. I found myself thinking that same night about Ray's quiet comment at the anniversary dinner. "Your mother used to do the books for me too, you know," said gently to Ellie, not to me directly, almost like a confession he wasn't quite brave enough to make out loud yet. I wondered, not for the first time that week, what it had cost him privately to watch this exact same pattern repeat itself a full generation later, and to say nothing meaningful about it until now. There were nights, during those weeks of quiet preparation, where I almost stopped. I want to be honest about that, because I think it would be dishonest to pretend the whole process felt like a straight line toward something clear and inevitable. One evening, Derek came home with flowers, unprompted, and cooked dinner himself for the first time in longer than I could remember, and some tired, hopeful part of me thought, maybe I've been building a case against a man who's actually trying. I put the folders away in a drawer that night, and didn't look at them again for 4 days. On the 5th day, he mentioned almost offhand over coffee that Grace had asked again about who exactly handles the day-to-day. And he'd told her, laughing, "Oh, that's mostly me at this point. Maya just helps when things get busy." I took the folders back out of the drawer that same afternoon. I think that was the moment I finally understood the flowers hadn't been nothing, but they hadn't been enough either, and that the difference between those two things was exactly what I needed to stop confusing. I raised the whole matter with Derek one final time, at home calmly, with no audience present and absolutely nothing left for either of us to prove to anyone else in the room. "I need you to correct the record with Grace and Marcus," I told him, keeping my voice even. Not just a slide with my name quietly added somewhere. The actual attribution, the systems, the strategy, all of it done properly. He was quiet for a long moment, and I let myself hope, one final time, that this particular version of the conversation might finally land somewhere different. "You knew what this was when you married me," he said instead, his voice tightening noticeably. "I'm not going to make myself look smaller in my own deal just so you can feel better about yourself." I didn't raise my voice. "I want you to understand that clearly, because it matters enormously for everything that happened afterward." I simply looked at him for a long moment across our own kitchen, and something inside me finally, completely settled into place. This wasn't really about the dinner anymore, or the slide deck, or even the investment deal itself. This was Derek, alone with me in our kitchen, with absolutely nobody watching and nothing left to perform, telling me plainly and directly exactly who he actually was once there was no audience left worth charming. He wasn't defending a careless slip of the tongue. He was defending an actual belief he genuinely held. "Okay," I said, "and I meant it the way you mean a door quietly closing, not the way you mean surrendering." He believed, walking away from that conversation, that he'd won it. I understood, driving nowhere in particular 20 minutes later, windows down, the radio off entirely, that he had actually just told me, plainly and without any prompting, exactly how little he genuinely intended to change, and that waiting patiently for him to change entirely on his own had never actually been a real plan at all. It had only ever been a very long, very quiet delay. The working dinner to finalize the deal terms took place 3 weeks later, back at the very same downtown restaurant, at a private table set for exactly 4. Derek, myself, Grace, and Marcus. I brought the folder with me. Dinner moved through its familiar, comfortable rhythm. Terms discussed carefully, numbers confirmed one by one, the same easy charm Derek always brings to rooms exactly like this one. Then Grace set down her wine glass, the same unhurried way she had at our anniversary dinner all those months earlier, and said, "We'll need the finalized operations documentation, with proper attribution for our records." Derek smiled, already reaching instinctively for the same deflection he'd used 100 times before. "She's basically my right hand on all of this," he said. "I can pull together whatever you both need." I opened the folder. I laid the pages out carefully, the exact way I'd walk any client through a discrepancy in their own books. One document at a time, no raised voice necessary, none required. My original strategy document, dated clearly 3 years earlier. The investor deck's language placed directly beside it, nearly word for word identical, credited only to leadership. The scheduling software's login history from the week Derek had tried to run it entirely alone, time-stamped and undeniable. "I built these systems," I said, my voice level and clear. "I've personally run them for 12 years. I'd like that reflected accurately in your documentation, and I think, honestly, you'd both want that too, for your own records." Grace studied the documents in front of her for a long, quiet moment, then nodded, entirely unsurprised in a way that told me she'd suspected something along these lines for months already. "Yes," she said simply. "We would want that." I watched Derek's charm falter, right there in front of the 2 people whose respect he had wanted more than almost anything else in the world. He tried once more. "I mean, obviously we worked together on all of it together." But the sentence had genuinely nowhere left to go. The documents in front of everyone at that table didn't care how he wanted the story told. "You told me I knew what this was when I married you," I said quietly, without any cruelty in it. "You were right. I just didn't fully understand, yet that it applied to both of us equally." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Marcus glanced uncertainly between the 2 of us. Grace closed the folder gently, carefully, and said, "We'll have our team update the documentation this week." Then, turning to me directly, "I'd like to speak with you separately when you have time about the consulting work we discussed." Derek had walked into that dinner genuinely believing this was a small formality he could smooth over with charm alone, the way he always had before. He had absolutely no idea I'd already quietly decided, weeks earlier, that this particular time, it wasn't going to work that way anymore. The rest of the dinner passed in a strange, careful quiet. Marcus asked a few polite questions about timelines. Grace and I talked briefly, professionally, about the consulting arrangement, as though we hadn't just watched a marriage's entire operating story come apart at a private table over appetizers. Derek said very little for the remainder of the meal. I don't think he was sulking exactly. I think he was doing the same thing I'd done in that restaurant bathroom months earlier, trying to hold his face still while something underneath it rearranged itself into a shape he hadn't chosen and couldn't yet name. When the valet brought the car around, he held the door for me the way he always does, an old habit from earlier, easier years. Neither of us said anything on the drive home. It wasn't an angry silence. It was the specific quiet of 2 people who both understood, without needing to discuss it, that something fundamental had just changed permanently, and that talking about it that same night would only get in the way of actually understanding it. The investment documentation was formally corrected within the week that followed. Grace's firm offered me an independent consulting contract shortly after, entirely separate from Derek's business, based on nothing but my own clearly demonstrated work. Derek had to renegotiate his own standing with Grace and Marcus on far more honest terms, without the comfortable story he'd been quietly telling for months. I watched that cost him something genuinely real. Not the deal itself, which ultimately survived intact, but a specific version of himself he had carefully built for that particular room and could no longer maintain there. At home, there was no dramatic explosion. I want to be honest about that, because it would make for a simpler, tidier story if there had been one. Instead, there was something quieter and considerably harder to sit with, a long, uncomfortable series of conversations that didn't resolve cleanly into anything neat or satisfying. Ellie called me that weekend and told me, a little shy about it, that she'd started crediting her own work more directly during her internship, after watching me correct the record calmly instead of loudly at that dinner. I used to think being easy to work with meant never asking for credit, she said. I genuinely don't think that anymore. Ray came by one quiet afternoon while Derek was still at the office, and we sat and had coffee together at our kitchen table. He was quiet for a while before he finally said it out loud. I should have said something to you a long, long time ago. I saw the pattern clearly. I lived through it myself with your mother-in-law and never once said a single word about it to anyone, including her. He looked genuinely older, saying that sentence, and more honest with me than I'd ever once seen him before. I'm proud of how you handled every bit of this. For the first time in a very long time, I honestly didn't know what would happen next between Derek and me. And for the first time, that particular uncertainty felt like real freedom to me, instead of fear. Derek and I had one real conversation that week, the kind we hadn't had in years, maybe ever. It was late, both of us at the kitchen table, the house quiet around us. He didn't apologize the way I'd once imagined he might, with a full accounting of everything he'd gotten wrong. Instead, he said, slowly, like the words cost him something to produce, I think I built a version of this whole thing where I was the reason any of it worked. I don't know when I started believing that instead of just knowing it wasn't true. You didn't build it alone, I said. Not the company. Not us. I know that now, he said. I'm not sure I knew it before tonight. It wasn't an ending, and I didn't treat it like one. But it was the first time he'd said something about himself that wasn't a defense of something, and I sat with that difference for a long time after he'd gone up to bed, turning it over carefully, the way you'd turn over a small, unfamiliar object to see if it was actually what it appeared to be. 3 months later, Derek and I are sitting in couples counseling together. Not performing any kind of reconciliation for anyone watching. There's genuinely no audience left to perform for anymore, which is exactly the point of doing it this way. It's slow, uneven, honest work, the kind that doesn't naturally make for a satisfying highlight reel. I formally launched my own consulting practice, with Grace's firm as my very first official client. I handed off the last of my unpaid duties at Voss Construction to a properly paid office manager. A boundary Derek resisted at first, quietly and stubbornly, and has since, grudgingly, come to genuinely respect as something necessary rather than something punitive aimed at him. He doesn't get everything right even now. Some old habits still surface when he's under real pressure. A joke that lands wrong at exactly the wrong moment. A beat where he almost answers a question that was actually meant for me. But for the first time in over 2 decades, when he catches himself minimizing me in some small way, he corrects it out loud, right there in the room, without anyone having to ask him to. It isn't much in the grand scheme of things. I want to be honest about that too. It's one corrected sentence, delivered in real time, in front of whoever happens to be listening at that moment. But I've slowly learned to notice the real difference between a man performing change, specifically for an audience, and a man quietly doing the work in an ordinary moment when nobody at all is grading his performance. Our counselor, a calm, unhurried woman named Dr. Patel, asked me once early on what I actually wanted out of the process. Not what I wanted from Derek, what I wanted specifically for myself. I remember sitting with that question longer than I expected to, because in 22 years of marriage, I'm not sure anyone had ever asked me that particular version of it before. I want to stop checking whether what I said landed, I told her eventually. I want to say something true and let it just exist in the room, without needing to watch his face to find out if it was allowed. Derek, sitting beside me, didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I didn't know that's what it felt like for you." It wasn't a big moment. Nobody cried. But it was the first time in longer than I could remember that he'd responded to something true about me with curiosity instead of defense, and I've learned slowly to notice when that particular shift happens, because it doesn't happen every time, but it happens more than it used to. I noticed the difference. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself genuinely believe it might actually last. Not because I desperately need it to anymore, but simply because, this time, it honestly might. Tonight I'm sitting at my desk in the home office I finally built entirely for myself, on a call with Grace about a promising new client. The framed future CFO photograph sits right beside my laptop now, moved off the mantle where it had quietly gathered dust for 20 full years without me ever really stopping to see it clearly. Through the open office door, I can hear Derek on the phone with a vendor in the next room. "Let me check with Maya," he says, without a single moment of hesitation, the exact way you'd mention the one person whose knowledge genuinely matters most. She'll know exactly how to handle this. It's a small sentence, barely worth mentioning on its own. I don't think he even notices himself saying it out loud anymore, which is its own quiet kind of proof that something has actually shifted. I used to believe, for the better part of 20 years, that if I simply kept proving my value through steady results instead of ever directly asking for recognition, someone would eventually notice entirely on their own and finally say so out loud, unprompted. I spent 2 full decades quietly waiting for that one sentence. I understand now, sitting here in this office that is entirely mine, that waiting for it was never actually a real plan to begin with. It was only ever a very patient, very quiet kind of hiding. Being useful and being genuinely valued were never actually the same thing, no matter how long I let myself believe otherwise for the sake of peace. Real partnership means being seen clearly for who you are, not simply relied upon quietly for what you provide. And waiting patiently to be noticed is not the same thing as building a life where you no longer have to be. I stopped waiting to be introduced properly and started simply walking into rooms as myself.